Hi everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about our very last chapter. Yeah, we came a long way. So we're going to talk about monetary policy in chapter 16. I'm trying to keep the chapter short, just like chapter 13, fiscal policy. Just know what we mean by monetary policy, the different types of monetary policy. We already talked about the Federal Reserve, the money market, the structure of the Federal Reserve policy tools in chapter 14. So definitely review chapter 14 before you start studying chapter 16. Also, you need to kind of review chapter 12, which was about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Because again, we're going to talk about fixing those recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps we had in chapter 12. So if you don't remember anything about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the Federal Reserve, pause the video, go back to chapter 12, chapter 14, and then come back and watch the rest of the video, okay? But if you remember everything, you're good to go. So if you look at the lecture notes, I put some sort of definition about monetary policy. We have, just like fiscal policy, we have two different types of monetary policy here. Fiscal policy, chapter 13, was about the federal government basically tools to fix the aggregate demand and fix the economy in case we have recession or inflation. Here in monetary policy, our focus is on Federal Reserve and how the Federal Reserve as a central bank can fix the economy if we have recession or inflation. So the Federal Reserve has its own policy tools that we discussed in chapter 14. So, and also remember that the Federal Reserve as a central bank controls the money market entirely. So the Federal Reserve can deal with recession or eliminate the recessionary gap by implementing the expansionary or easy monetary policy. And when it comes to inflation and dealing with inflationary gap, the Federal Reserve can implement the restrictive or tight monetary policy. So check the lecture notes. I'm going to explain the expansionary monetary policy first, and then we're going to move on to the next one. It's kind of the concept of expansionary monetary policy is very, very similar to expansionary fiscal policy we had in previous chapter 13. Very similar. The Federal Reserve here is trying to fight the recession. Okay, so right now, because of COVID-19, we entered a kind of recession. Hopefully, it won't be a deep recession. But we see that many people are losing their jobs. The economy is slow. We know what we mean by real GDP by now, so there's a possibility for the real GDP to drop. We don't know, of course, by how much, but it will drop because the labor force actually, the number of people in the labor force is going down, so the amount of output that people are going to produce will go down. So the Federal Reserve as a central bank actually can kind of boost the economy during recession times. And remember, during recession times, as we discussed in chapter 12, there will be a gap between the current real GDP, the actual GDP, and the potential GDP. Again, as a reminder, potential GDP was the level of real GDP when the economy is at full employment. But when we have recession, the actual GDP is less than potential GDP. We call that gap recessionary gap. So the economy is slow, unemployment rate is high, so the Federal Reserve starts to implement this expansionary monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve goal basically here is to encourage people to spend more money, to invest more in the economy by reducing the interest rate. That's the main thing that the Federal Reserve can do during recession times. And by the way, just to compare with what's happening in the economy right now, the Federal Reserve started, and if you remember, we also talked about it in our class at the beginning kind of the semester, that the Federal Reserve started cutting the interest rate, I should say, unfortunately, at the beginning of this year once, and also 2 or 3 times last year. But we really didn't need that interest rate cut before this recession happened. So anyway, the Federal Reserve already cut the interest rate. So the Federal Reserve right now, during this recession that is caused by COVID-19, cannot do much about the interest rate. But when we typically see the recession, the best thing that the Federal Reserve can do in terms of that expansionary monetary policy is to reduce the interest rate. And the Federal Reserve has its own policy tools to reduce the interest rate. If you remember, there was an inverse relationship between the supply of money and interest rate in chapter 14, the money market. So definitely review that part. So the Federal Reserve actually can reduce the interest rate by increasing the supply of money. And that's another thing that the Federal Reserve is going to do even right now when we're dealing with COVID-19 recession. And the Federal Reserve actually is able to print money if it wants. So the Federal Reserve can increase the supply of money, so, and basically inject money in the money market. If the Federal Reserve does that, then the interest rate actually will drop. Remember, the money supply will increase, so we have a rightward shift in supply of money. And if you remember, the supply of money is vertical, so money demand is not going to change. The change in money demand is coming from us, individuals, businesses. So money demand is not going to change, but there will be a rightward shift in supply of money, and as a result, the interest rate will go down. So that's the main thing that the Federal Reserve can do in terms of dealing with a recession and eliminating the recessionary gap. But remember, we also talked about multiplier effect in previous chapter 13. So as soon as the Federal Reserve changes the interest rate, things will change at the macroeconomic equilibrium. So interest rate is now low because of the Federal Reserve's actions, but we'll see basically the impact in the macroeconomic equilibrium, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So the Federal Reserve now reduced the interest rate. So it means that borrowing is less expensive. Remember, interest rate is the opportunity cost of borrowing money. So borrowing money is now cheap when the interest rate is low. So the investors are going to borrow more money. They're going to spend more money in the economy. Individuals are going to get more loans. They are going to buy new houses, new cars, personal loans. So people start spending in the economy. So C component in aggregate demand along with I investment are increasing. So these two factors can increase the aggregate demand. We will have the rightward shift in aggregate demand, but again, because of the multiplier effect at the new equilibrium, level of real GDP will go up. It means that people have more money to spend, more income. So one more time, the aggregate demand will increase because of the multiplier effect, and this eventual increase in aggregate demand will happen over and over again. So we had recession and we had recessionary gap because the level of output was low, because that aggregate demand was low, but because of the Federal Reserve's actions, indirectly the aggregate demand will increase, and eventually there won't be any gap between the real GDP, current real GDP, and potential GDP. So the Federal Reserve can reduce the interest rate, and as a result, the aggregate demand will increase. Of course, how fast this time around, recession caused by COVID-19, how fast the aggregate demand will go up because of the Federal Reserve's actions, we don't know. But something that we can kind of be sure about is that the federal government can actually boost the economy probably faster than the Federal Reserve, because the interest rate was already low. We're entering into the era that people don't have jobs. They're filing for unemployment benefits. So a lower interest rate is not going to be that effective. It might be helpful in the future, in the long run, but right now, the appropriate fiscal policy is good for the situation that we are living in and the recession that we already kind of entered because of the COVID-19. But in terms of economic concept and models, that's pretty much it about the expansionary monetary policy. So in the next video, I will talk about contractionary fiscal policy, which is exactly the opposite of expansionary fiscal policy. Monetary policy. And we're pretty much done with this chapter. As I said, this is the last chapter. I'm trying to keep it short. So follow the lecture notes. Definitely read the textbook, but if I'm not covering something in the notes, it won't be on the test, okay? So in the next video, I'll talk about the second type of monetary policy. Bye for now.